So Kevin, over to you. And if you'd like to show some slides, please share those now.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me, and a particular thank you to Martin for that absolutely wonderful talk, full of wisdom, full of things I didn't already know, and so clearly put together. Okay, so I'll start with a couple of comments stemming from directly from Martin's talk. There were many important ideas running through it, and two I draw attention to was the importance in knowing about differences in timescales in which things occur, taking into account the short timescales of political action or political thought and the ways we can work with those. And also the many ways in which Martin discussed ethics. Ethics is so important in this, ethics from very many different views. Martin talked about the ethics of CRISPR-Cas9, genetic modification, a whole list of things. Something that I think we don't always give enough thought to is the ethical aspects of the kind of modeling that this program has been about, or even the ethics of pure mathematics. To what extent is this just thought? To what extent do mathematicians, do modelers need to worry, need to be ethically concerned about the things they do, the uses of the things they do, and how that might be put together? I think that hasn't always had sufficient thought. I'll just say no more than that, and that it needs rather more thought than it's been getting. Anyway, my own interest in this is, one always talks about what one knows about. It was so good to hear Martin talking about space. I have increasingly over the years worked with journalists, worked with the media in various different ways, and that does have a tendency to lead one, because I'm in a developed country, to fret about these minor, relatively unimportant concerns that Martin mentioned. But it also has led me to some understanding, I hope, of the way the media operate. And I'd certainly agree with what Martin said in his call to action at the end of his talk about the role of the media and how a way that scientists and similar researchers can influence politicians is through public pressure, through the media. And I think that's terribly important. So I want to say a few words, rather disconnectedly, about how we might get the kind of change that Martin was emphasizing that we absolutely need. There's a lot of work on how one communicates risk and uncertainty. We want things to change, and the change often involves persuading large numbers of people to change their behavior, change their minds, change their behavior. So someone has to know about how to communicate risk, how to promote behavior change, how to think about ethics. And the sort of people who know about that kind of thing aren't necessarily the sort of people that are doing the technological research, who are doing the mathematical modeling. There's endless research to the effect that people don't understand uncertainty. People out there don't understand uncertainty, so it's difficult to get this across. I have to say there is huge disagreement on what it is about uncertainty that people don't understand and how to get it across, but there's been plenty of research on that. But there are many issues about understanding of risk that stem from that. But I'd like to draw attention just to one thing I noticed recently. Tim Harford, the journalist and economist, had a new book that came out last week, How to Make the World Add Up, 10 Rules for Thinking Differently About Numbers. And this is sort of aimed at public people who see numbers reported in the media and elsewhere. His first rule isn't anything about the numbers directly. For rule 1, search your feelings. How do you think about this? What are your values about this? How might this thing that some statistician or whoever has put forward, how's that affecting the way that you think about it? Can you step back? Can you take another point of view? That's what that's about. And it's very interesting that that's where he chooses to start, I think. Okay, moving on. Who's going to do the communication? Is it us as modelers, you as modelers? Well, there are communication specialists, so there are journalists, there are the media. But can we afford not to get involved at all? I don't think we can. If we can't get it across to the communications people, if we can't get it across to the journalists, they can't get it across to the public. They can't get it across to the politicians. So we have to be able to get our ideas across using the right language. And it's a long way from trying to get what's in your head as a modeler into their heads. That's not how it works. They have different attitudes, they have different backgrounds and so on. A brief comment that I think the communication of modeling results in particular during the current pandemic has often not been that good. And that's not surprising because it's difficult. It involves ideas that non-modelers may never have thought about. There are just a few points there, which I shall gloss over very quickly because we're a bit short of time. Some of them are to do with media distortions. Some of them are to do with us just not telling people things because we know them and don't see the need to tell others because we think they know them too, and we're wrong. You've got to remember that it's a long way from research to the public. Here is one particular route. This is through conventional media. The research gets done somehow. It's reported in a paper, conference, talk, preprint, whatever. And then maybe it gets press released by the university, by an institution. Most pieces of research don't get press released. It may be picked up by the media and lead to a press story. There will be a headline on the press story or on the story on a news website, which won't be written by the journalist typically and may distort what's going on. And then people may choose to read it. This is a long route in a lot of ways of falling off the plan during the way. One thing that I spotted just earlier on this week, this is the podcast produced by David Spiegelhalter, the statistician who I'm sure most or all of you have heard of. He's currently the chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication at Cambridge. He was for many years the Winton Professor of the Public Understanding of Risk at Cambridge. And he has this podcast produced through the Winton Centre. This week's episode had two speakers, Brooke Rogers, who's a behavioural scientist at King's College London, a participant in SAGE, who advises the UK government on things to do with coronavirus and risks to national security, and John Krebs, very distinguished zoologist who became head of the Food Standards Agency, where he had all sorts of communication issues to deal with. I'm not going to go through any of that. I suggest you listen to it. It's really good. But this is something that Brooke Rogers said about her communication. I felt that quite often the solutions were being drawn primarily from the physical sciences, which is fine, but with very little thought about how publics or how people use these tools might think about them. And when the public were considered, she talks about Hollywood-esque assumptions about their behavior, their appetite for risk, their perceptions of risk. And what she was trying to do was to bring more reality into what was going on. And because that would lead to trickle down, that would lead to the politicians understanding what was going on and being able, if they chose to do so, to implement things in a way that would actually work with the public. There are many feedback loops within this, I think, are very important. This is a very useful and long article that came out in Royal Society Open Science last year, led by people at the Winton Centre again, communicating uncertainty about facts, numbers and science. And there's lots of interesting detail on there on how to do this well in a limited context, but they still managed to write a paper that was 42 pages long on it. But I just want to talk about one aspect of this, which is the authorship. There are the authors, and I've highlighted their names to show the fields that they work in. So several of them, the lead author and some of the others, are in psychology and neuroscience at the Winton Centre and at Columbia in the Department of Psychology. There is Alex Freeman, who is also at the Winton Centre and who's an expert in science communication and journalism. Before she went to the centre, she was a television producer. And there are James Mitchell and Ara Gavin, who from Warwick, who are economists, who are economists and forecasters. And then eventually we get to David Spiegelhalter, who's a statistician, but he's a lot more than your typical statistician. Doing this effectively needs interdisciplinary work. It needs us to look outside the areas of mathematics and statistics and to work with people that many of us are simply not used to working with, whether they be journalists or whether they be social scientists in these varied fields and things like that. So I think I'll just finish this off by presenting a couple of examples that are discussed in that paper of how to communicate without going into any detail on them. This is an example. It's not from the paper. They presented separately. It's actually from a BMJ article by another psychologist, Gerd Gigerenzer in Berlin, who I've worked with a bit. He shows two ways of presenting information to a woman who's having to make a choice about whether to present for breast screening, breast mammography. And he points out that the sort of way to do this that may be considered normal by some statisticians would be to talk in terms of conditional probabilities and Bayes' theorem. There are lots of things like this, and you get a number like that. What he recommends, and there's lots of research to show that this helps in communicating, and it's what's presented in the current British documentation about the breast screening program, is to present things in terms of numbers. You start off with 1,000 women, 10 of them have got breast cancer, and some of them haven't, and some of them have positive and some of them have negative tests in the way shown there. And then you need a bit of arithmetic, but most people can at least understand that to a certain extent to see what the probability of breast cancer is given a positive test result. And that works much better. Here's a rather more complicated example. This is from an earlier IPCC report. The IPCC reports, particularly recent ones, are terribly good on the way not only that they express uncertainty, but in the way that they have general recommendations and working practices about how to express uncertainty. I don't expect you to understand this chart directly from looking at it for a few seconds, just to say that it does show uncertainty. Panels B and C in it do show how changes in the modeling assumptions can work through to changes in the uncertainty. There's just a discussion of how this works. This is too complicated, I'd say, for communicating to the general public, but it's a good way of communicating to those who are sort of in the loop, or the modelers in particular, though they could understand it in different ways. But also technical civil servants, people like that, would be able to follow something like this and would be able to understand the uncertainties. And my final example on this is from something that, again, work that the Winton Centre did in collaboration with the NHS. And it's an online tool demonstrating various, there's one for breast cancer, there's one for prostate cancer, there may be others now. The different ways of showing the outcomes for women based on the inputs that typically their doctor or health professional would have entered. And so you enter various characteristics: what type of cancer did they have, what other possible therapies are on offer, and so on. And this is one way of presenting this, but what I really like about this is that there's a choice. You can choose to present the data in completely different ways. Here's another way of presenting it. Here's the results for women shown as a graph for people that like looking at graphs, for people who can deal with graphs, and people that can compare graphs. And that has to be said is not everybody. It's not, to be honest, even all medics. So I think I'll stop there, but I would like to finish by very much welcoming what Martin said at the end of his talk, his call to action. There are these existential risks, there are more immediate risks, there are short-term, perhaps not terribly important risks. Modelers know about aspects of these risks, and we need to work with others to get that across. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Kevin.